Hello and welcome to episode number 7 of the Music Behind the Magic podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Goodman, and as always, it is my goal to celebrate with all of you the magic of Disney songs, scores, and soundtracks from the movies to the parks. Today is a very exciting episode for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was inspired by our community. One of our listeners and Facebook group contributors, Wendy Welker Brown, hello Wendy, suggested an episode discussing Disney and Dixieland and jazz. And it just so happens that there's a great book that was recently released just about this topic. It's called Cool Cats and a Hot Mouse, A History of Jazz and Disney. And the author of that book, Matt Hodge, graciously agreed to be part of the podcast today. What follows is a fascinating exploration of how Disney and jazz have been so closely connected over the years. I love having this community play a part in the topics we explore, and that's either suggesting things you want to hear about or asking questions that you want answered. So please continue to let me know what you want to hear about. Drop me an email at jrg@musicbehindthemagic.com or find me on social or join our group Facebook page where there's a lot of great discussions going on. And also, please, if you are enjoying this podcast, I ask you spread the word and like, subscribe, and share. And if you are also so inclined, if you happen to have a couple of seconds, any ratings or reviews on Apple or Spotify or Amazon would be so very much appreciated. With that, please settle in and enjoy our discussion of the wild, cool, and swinging history of Disney and jazz. And to get you all in the mood, here's a brief clip of the amazing pianist Grayson Smith, who plays in front of Casey's Corner in Disney World, playing the 12th Street Rag. Enjoy. We are so excited today to be joined by Matthew Hodge. Matt is an award-winning composer, best-selling author, and professor, currently based in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's worked in professional theater, international television, award-winning films, New York City celebrity events, national commercial pitches, award-winning video game prototypes, and has served hundreds of musical clients spanning all 50 states and over 30 countries. He's the author of Cool Cats and a Hot Mouse, A History of Jazz and Disney, which has reached Amazon bestseller status and has won 4 national writing awards. Matt currently teaches music and theater at William Peace University. Matt, thank you so much for joining. It's so nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you too, Jonathan. I'm honored. Thank you.
It
And
was
the
great.
podcast, I was looking at it when you sent to me. It's relatively new, right? Like you just started it?
This is episode number 7.
That's exciting.
It's great. It's fun, and look, you know more than most. Music is it's a passion for a lot of people. And I think there's people who love Disney. There's people who love music. I figured why not put them both together, and it's so evocative and powerful. It's just a great thing to talk about, and I think people get excited about it.
Oh yeah, and it's wonderful for you to join the community. I've started to meet a lot of like different podcasters that talk about Disney in different angles, different ways, and have been excited to have been invited on as a guest on multiple podcasts, the Disney podcast, the last year or so. So it's exciting to see that community. It's just full of really warm and beautiful people from all around, and everyone just has like this love of it, which is wonderful. It's like a family.
Something, it is very much like a family. And you talk about Disney, you talk about home, you talk about family, you talk about passion and love. It is probably one of the more cohesive, pleasant groups of communities to be around, right? Like, I mean, look, we live in a world where there's lots of partisanship and lots of division. It's nice to be a part of something that can actually bring people together.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love.
Well, thank you for being a part. I mentioned early in the introduction, you have an unbelievably, broad and deep experience in music and theater. Tell us a bit about your backstory. How did you get to be who you are musically and, career wise?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, it helps to be a workaholic. I never stop. Yeah, no, my whole life, I mean, ever since I was 4, I think I started taking piano lessons when I was 4 years old. Like ever since I was, just a couple of years old on this planet Earth, I always knew like music was my destiny somehow. I just had a passion for it. But what I loved was I loved like all aspects of music. I loved how music told stories. I liked the theory, the mathematics of music. I loved the different instruments and how they were constructed. I loved compositional techniques. Like I love the psychology of music. Growing up, I loved all aspects of music, which now I can see as an adult really helped shape my career and experiences because not that I get bored easily, but I love just looking at stuff from a bunch of different angles. And there's always so many paths that I wanted to go down. And, I talk to a lot of my students and about when they're trying to figure out what they want to do in life. And I'm big on like, as long as you're very centered on what your passion is, that can open so many doors for you. So my whole career, I use that seed of, well, I love music, but what does that mean? And that's such a huge umbrella. And so throughout growing up in school and then grad school and getting multiple degrees and masters and becoming a professor, but also a composer, but also a teacher, but also musical theater, but also, and a music consultant in the industry, but also a writer about it. Like to me, it all is the same thing because it's just me geeking out about what I love. And I get to do it in different ways, which is exciting. So I have, my biggest passion is teaching. I knew I always wanted to be a teacher because the people that were most impactful in my life, besides my family and my good friends, were my teachers. And so I always wanted to do that. So I always knew teaching would be a part of it. So I always knew I wanted to be a college professor. I just like that age because it's such an exciting age of you're not a kid. You're thinking for yourself. You're away from mom and dad, but also you're discovering over those 4 years, like really who you are, how you see the world. Why do you see the world that way? What do you want to do in the world? And what's your passion? And so I love doing that. I'm going into my 15th year of being a college professor. But also in college, it's great that they encourage you. They want you to be a professional in your field as well. Like they don't, yes, we're in the classroom a lot, but they also encourage you to still be out doing what you talk about. And so it's allowed me to also be a writer and composer and all of these things that I do, musician. Because it all goes back to makes me a better teacher. So my students know whatever I tell them on Monday in the classroom, I'm doing myself on Saturday with my own people and agent and career. So it's all tied together. And Disney from the get-go, Disney was very much a part of my life. I'm very traditional in the sense of when I started learning songs on the piano, what were those first few songs I learned? Well, of course, it's Disney. I remember the very first song I ever learned how to play. It was like the one note melody of It's a Small World from a big note music book. And I did it in a talent show. Uh, I don't think I,
Did you win?
I think I came in second if I remember. I know, right? Oh, Chris, I'm still bitter about it. But yeah, I was like 5 or something like that. But yeah, and I would, when I started to learn to analyze music theory, I would do it with Disney. And so Disney's very much been a part of my life and even my career, because part of my career I'm fascinated with is the like psychology of pop culture and what becomes popular. Why does it become popular? What does that say about us as humans making it popular, especially with storytelling? So a lot of my academic work with not just the book that I wrote that I guess we'll talk about
For
in a
sure.
minute. So I do a lot of like articles for academic journals and presentations at academic conferences. Um, and a lot of it is focused on storytelling and what stories do we tell and why do we tell them and what does that say about us as a society, as civilization, as people? And so obviously Disney is one of the big storytellers in mainstream pop culture. So I get to talk a lot about Disney. So I've gotten to write several articles about Disney and of course my book by Disney. I do a lot of conference presentations. I just a couple of weeks ago presented at an international academic conference for Disney scholars, and that was a lot of fun. And so yeah, my whole career has been about music, and to this day, I still love it, and I wake up excited about life and my passion because I get to do it in so many different ways. So I never get bored, and I also never feel limited.
Yeah, I was gonna say you probably don't have time to be bored because you're constantly flexing all those mental muscles and musical muscles. You mentioned I noticed a couple of things you wrote about. It seems to be a lot of the intersection of pop culture and music. I know you wrote something about Gladiator. I know you wrote something about pop culture between Japan and the U.S. and even Batman, right? Batman
Yeah.
villains. Yep. Are you a pop culture nerd? Is that just a natural thing for you to do? Because I mean, it's what a great intersection of things that you love.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Huge pop culture nerd. And I think it makes me a better teacher too because of my classroom. That I'm a teacher. I love conversation. I'm not someone that just wants to like turn on my PowerPoint and just lecture at you for 2 hours and then just regurgitate facts for me on a test. Like I love being in the classroom and having great conversations. And so with my students, I'm able to have conversations on different levels with them. The professor academic quote unquote scholarly side, you have to be able to critique something. You have to be able to look at it from all different angles, intellectually and psychologically, and be honest about flaws on it. But then also just as a human, you can also fan out about stuff too, right? So yeah, like my first book was on Disney. My second book I wrote a year or so after that one, was about Batman.
Yeah.
uh, but it's the same thing of like, so for example, if I'm talking about Disney in my classes, within 1 2 hour class, I can navigate the students through different conversations, and we'll have academic conversations about it. We'll celebrate the history of it certain ways. We'll criticize some of its flaws. We'll talk about some of the controversies of it. I'll show them all different sides of something, and let them decide for themselves how we do it. And then I also can just geek out with them and, have a fun chat about like the latest Disney movie and, as a fanboy, also talk about it. So there's a bunch of different ways to do it, which is also why in my writings I enjoy doing different styles. Usually if you're writing for like an academic journal or presenting at an academic conference, you have to present more of a scholarly version of it, which often means you have to, you can't just be a fanboy about it and be like, look how great Disney is. Like, Disney's not perfect. And it leads to interesting conversations. Like the presentation I did a few weeks ago for this International Disney Scholars not competition conference that I got invited to speak on. It was on The Lion King on Broadway. And it's just, the most successful Broadway show in the history of planet Earth.
Amazing.
Um,
Amazing.
yeah. And yeah. But I got to present it in a bunch of different ways and throughout different perspectives. And of course, like just as Matt, I love it. Right. And so I've seen it, 4 times on Broadway, whatnot. But as a scholar, I have to also lead discussions of debates of what's happening on stage. Is this authentic representation? Is it musical and cultural appropriation for a Western audience? Is it a mixture of both? Where is that line? And who gets to decide? Who draws even the line? Like, and so those are conversations that I enjoy. So I enjoy talking about pop culture, and I enjoy every day navigating being a human who is a fan, but also an adult scholar who also can recognize things that we need to talk about, even if it's more serious or controversial. And I don't think those have to be mutually exclusive. Same thing, like I'm a huge fan of Batman. Like all my friends know, Batman's my favorite comic book
Wow,
world, which is why I wrote a whole book on it.
for
But
sure.
obviously, I'm doing like an academic scholarly lecture on comic books. I have to point out not just the fun stuff, but like, is there problematic stuff with it, and what are the negative and positive traits about how it's injected in society. And but that doesn't mean me as Matt doesn't then go home and pop in a Batman movie, and enjoy it and fan out.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's something to be said about, rationally knowing how much you love something, but being a deep thinker enough to be like, all right, this is not perfect. You can still love something and not being perfect. And you can even use your powers and, your experience to try to make things better and make people understand it better.
Yeah, and actually, it was all of this sort of. I guess I can talk about the Disney book I wrote for a
Yeah,
minute because it's actually a
please.
struggle because that was my first time trying to write something that we call sort of more like a casual reader tone. Right up until then, all of my writings were very, academic, right? And so if you're writing an academic scholarly journal or article for an academic journal, that's a very specific type of tone. It's going to sound like a textbook. It's going to have big words. It's going to, not that there's pretentiousness to it, but it's a different tone, right? It's not what we just sort of call like a beach read, right? It's meant for, scholarly discussion in a classroom. But when I started to have conversations with the editor and the publisher about it, I came up with the idea because in all of my research, I had noticed because I just am a fan of jazz. Jazz
I
is a
was going to ask you about that. Yeah, I was going to ask you how
yeah,
so please, yeah, talk about
yeah,
how the book
yeah.
came to be. Yeah.
Yeah, so all of my lover of music, obviously there's tons of different genres. And so jazz was always one I loved. We always had jazz music playing in the background in home, and I was in jazz band all through school, and jazz was one of the first styles I really dove into when I was older, like in high school, and took private lessons in piano just for jazz. And then, as I got older, studied it more and more. So I love all types of music and lecture on all types of music, but jazz is one of them. And originally, this book was going to be something different. I'm going to discuss sort of different genres, but I noticed in my research that there was so many. Uh, the conversation of jazz and Disney was either like a chapter in a book, or there were tons of books. There was a lot of books about Disney music and a lot of books about jazz, but there wasn't huge, like a holistic book approach to the combination of them. And the more that I started to just dive into research and look at it, the more I discovered just how much these two industries really impacted each other. And they both were built up at the same time, like throughout the 20th century. And they both became at one point this huge intersection, and they both were defining American entertainment. And so it's this notion of, I was kind of shocked that there hadn't been an entire book about it. And so that's when the publisher and I had discussions, and I was like, I think this is the direction I want to go, and here's why, and here's the research I found, and here's sort of my angle I would do with it. And they got excited because they also said, because they were publishers of people writing books about Disney, and they agreed. They said, yeah, in all of our research, we've never seen a book that is just solely 100% completely devoted to these two worlds intersecting. And then when I started writing the book, I didn't even realize what I would find I didn't know if this was going to end up being a bummer of a book. Like, am I going to unearth a lot of controversy that I didn't realize? I had no idea like where the research would take me. So I was pleased to find really beautiful stories to get to share along with some of the controversial stuff I discussed in the book. But the tone of it was made very clear from the publisher of like, this is not a textbook. This is a beach read, right?
Yeah.
This is want someone to just pick it up and sit in a chair and read. And and you would think that might be easier because it's less big words and trying to sound fancy or whatnot. It was so much harder because it was, here's something really important that I want to say. Here's how I would write that in two highbrow paragraphs in a scholarly academic journal. Now I need to say it in two sentences how I would say it to my friend. And
Mm.
that was hard, but still also have an impact. And the notion of, obviously, if you're going to talk about jazz and the history of jazz, well, obviously, a lot of discussions of culture, race, societal issues have to come up. I mean, how could they not?
Yeah.
Uh, but yet, I also didn't want it to be an entire book about race or the history of racism in America either. That's not what the book was. And so it was hard. It was a struggle. And I remember writing a couple of initial chapters that I worked with the publisher on to make sure, like, is this the right direction? Because to me, it was a fun topic, but a serious topic, but it needs to have weight to it and not be shy to address some of the seriousness that's going to come along with studying those histories. But it's also not diving so hard into it that now it's becoming something that it's not. But also like a fun beach read. Like it was, how do I balance that? So it was fun. I think the first chapter I wrote, if I remember correctly, was I think it was the one on Jungle Book. Um, but it was just to like get the tone right. And then once I sort of locked into that, then I had fun and just dove down the rabbit hole and into it.
Just gotta get one out of the way, right? And I want to dive in more because you raised a couple of very interesting things that I wanted to ask you about. One is, jazz in the movies, jazz in the parks. There's like threads of jazz all over the place. But when you said the tone, I have to read something that really resonated with me. It was at the very beginning, and I think it encapsulates everything perfectly. So, please don't mind, the Brooklyn accent trying to talk about what you said, but you wrote these two paragraphs that just so beautifully intertwine, how jazz and Disney go together. And you say, jazz offers a soundtrack of a nation's history. Its music tells stories of race, war, struggle, relationships, religion, rebellion, freedom, existence, and endurance. Jazz celebrates the soul of America. Disney offers a soundtrack of an idealized nation. Its empire tells stories of fantasy, love, values, imagination, discovery, optimism, innocence, vision, and innovation. Disney celebrates the heart of America. And I just think that is so beautifully put and just so sets the scene so perfectly for how these two things intertwine. I just love it. And really kind of the whole book is in that vein. So I just thought it was terrific.
So much. Yeah, that touches my heart that you read those two paragraphs. That ending of chapter one, were sort of my North Star. I remember I wrote those two paragraphs early on, and I had them up on my screen as I was writing the rest of the book because it was sort of my North Star to always go back to like, what's the point of this,
Yeah.
right? Because especially in today's age, I'm big on, everyone has a computer on their phone. Everyone's walking around with a computer in their pocket. So if I'm just gonna say a bunch of facts, like cool facts, well, I mean, you can look that up in 2 seconds, right? What can I talk about that's just not going to be spit out by Google? How do I make it interesting? And how do I get to the heart of like what I find interesting about it and inspiring and about stories? Same thing, like a lot of the chapters focused on specific individuals.
Yeah.
But it was really big on like, well, I don't want to just write this the way you would like a Wikipedia article. And I want to get quotes from people like or research quotes from them or people who knew them and really humanize them because so many of these names are just sort of iconic pillars to us, right? But who were they as people? And to really try to focus every chapter. And I worked hard for every chapter to be very bite sized, right? The publisher was big on that, right? Like we want the chapters to be small bite size. So they're very tangible. So it's like, okay, what's the point of this? What's the heart of this human? Not let me just write their huge Wikipedia resume, but like, what was the point of this human? And why did they connect to Disney? And what was beautiful was a lot of the people I wrote about ended up like they really enjoyed their time with Disney. The whole idea of race in America was very much on the how people discussed it academically from the outside of it. But when you got to the heart of like, here's this singer or artist, here's this Disney project or whatever they worked on, and 90% of them loved it. Not all of them, I talk about some controversial stuff in the book, but for most of them, they loved it. It wasn't their Disney project wasn't necessarily the most famous thing they did or what they won their Grammy Awards for, but just as a human, they loved it and enjoyed it. And it was nice to get to kind of celebrate that and celebrate them as humans.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does. It was, and I guess going back to the source, right? Was Walt a jazz fan? I mean, did it all start with him, or did this intersection of Disney and jazz evolve over just like you said, because they were just two ascending things at the same time?
No, I mean there is quite a bit to show. Like Disney really loved jazz, and he really liked jazz artists. I mean I talk about in the book that Walt was pushy at times of like I want to work with this person or I want this sound or artist came into the Disney fold for a project because like they were personally requested to like I want this person or I love jazz. It was really evident. Now I don't know if we can make the claim like jazz was his favorite genre and he was a pioneering fighter for jazz. But it's very clear. And one of the first really cool instances of that we see is the Silly Symphonies. Like the Silly
Mhm.
Symphonies one of my favorite chapters to write, because most of the time when people think about Disney, and like if I ask my students, like, what sort of built the House of Mouse, right? A lot of them, if they know history, they'll say Snow White. We sort of use Snow White as a tracker of time of like, this is when, this is the foundation that the Disney empire was built on. But Snow White would have never happened without the silly symphonies for like a decade before, where they were perfecting all of these techniques of animation and sound and music and color. And some of the silly symphonies have not aged well. Some of them I talk about, but one that is fantastic was about jazz. The entire thing was on jazz. And it used jazz music in an interesting way of like jazz is the character in it. It's called Musicland, and it's about this island that represents jazz music, and another island represents classical music, and all the instruments are, human-like. But it's a fantastic. It's for the era. It's really well put together, and jazz is used as the main character and the score and the message of it and the personality of it. And it was about the culture war of should jazz how is mainstream society viewing jazz
Hmm.
during that time, and especially through different eyes of race and whatnot, because jazz went up and down in popularity and controversy and all that stuff. So we see even early on, like jazz is he confronts jazz head on and makes commentary about it. It makes commentary of jazz deserves a place in culture. Jazz in some ways is a superior genre to other music, depending on what you're looking at. So there's clues even from the very beginning, before he's going to get huge with his movies. Jazz is going to be important, and then when he builds the parks, jazz is throughout the parks in interesting ways. And it's almost like 6 degrees of separation. Almost anything in the Disney universe somehow can be traced back to jazz, either a genre of music or a person or a project. Like jazz was such a huge intertwining empire being built with the Disney empire at the same time. And that's why I said that they were so fascinating to discuss and write about, because they literally were being, not that they were being built at the same time, but they were growing in popularity at the same time. And they really did. There was a peak in American entertainment that Disney was defining American stories, and jazz was defining American music. It's happening at the same time. And then when there was controversies with them, then that also made it interesting. I think I described in the book that they were like two ships, like passing in the night and also crashing into each other. And they could help and hurt each other.
Yeah.
And Walt was a part of that.
I know you wrote about Louis Armstrong, obviously one of the bellwethers of American jazz, right? And I remember reading, and there was like a 1962 TV special called Disneyland After Dark, and I think Walt actually brought Louis Armstrong and reunited him with some of his old bandmates for the first time in numerous years. So, like, this is an example of Walt being responsible to a certain extent for bringing jazz back to the mainstream. If I don't know about how it was in the '60s, but if it wasn't as prominent as it used to be, it certainly got more exposure and kind of shed that light on Louis Armstrong and the magnificent talent that he was.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Louis Armstrong. I mean, he is just one of those greats and not just jazz, but just music in general. And yeah, his chapter was another example that was so fun to write about, because it was, the more you discovered in the research, the more you realized how Disney was a part of him as a human. And his album he did for Disney, he was so passionate about and loved. And to me, the story that I loved was that he personally loved his version of When You Wished Upon a Star. And it's also historic because that album is the last recording of him doing singing and playing his own trumpet.
Oh,
Um, But in the book, I talk about how he said not only did he love making that album, it was one of the most fun he'd ever had, but he still listened at night to his recording of When You Wish Upon a Star. And if you listen closely to it, there's a second in it where he sort of dedicates it to his mom, and he says "Mama" in it.
Ah,
And so he talked about how like at night to go to sleep, like he would listen to his own recording. And and again, when people think of Louis Armstrong, that's not always necessarily the go-to one of what won him awards or what made him really famous. But if you were to just ask him as a human, what did you love working on? The his Disney album was one of his most favorite projects he ever did. And the fact that out of all the incredible music that he listened or that he wrote and produced, the one that he enjoyed listening to himself was his random rendition of When You Wish Upon a Star. And that he also like talks about his like throws a beautiful loving nod to his mother in the middle of the song. Like, it's little stories like that that make it interesting and humanize it.
yeah.
Right. I would just want to say, oh, and isn't it cool that Louis Armstrong did a Disney album? But the point of it is that the human Louis or Lewis, right? He kind of went by both.
Yeah.
But that the human part of him, he loved it and it was just fun for him. And he found a way to let a Disney recording connect him to his mother, who was, a huge person for him. And so when I listen to that recording, that's what I think about. I think about, wow, this was him saying mama and dedicating to his mom. And this is what he would listen to at night when he was going to sleep. You know, it makes it so much more beautiful and human.
And again, also just shows you the power that Disney music has culturally, and in the hearts and souls, like you talk about in the book, right? It's where heart and soul meet is right there. I want to talk with you, about jazz in the movies, and then I want to shift to jazz in the parks. But let's talk about jazz in the movies. You talked about the silly symphonies as the basis for it, but throughout Disney's movie history, you have the early years, which is maybe more classical or operetta, and then you have like the middle, the silver age, which is maybe more contemporary. Then you have the Renaissance. But
Mhm.
even you have, which is Broadway based, if you will, and that's kind of carried through. But even with all those various eras with defining type of musical tones, there's still been an element of jazz throughout the whole thing. Like you said, Jungle Book, and even now recently, and I know your book ends by talking about Princess and the Frog, but then you had soul. So
Yeah, as soon as I remember I got annoyed, not annoyed, but I was like, dang it, like that should have been the perfect, literally stole because you turn the book in way before it gets published. It has to go through editing and layout and format and all that stuff. So when I wrote the book, Soul was not anything. Like it hadn't come out. I don't even think there had been like an announcement about it. So I had no idea this thing called Soul was coming out. But then when the book was finally getting published, it was released very close. I can't remember. It was either like right before or right after, but it was very close to Soul. And then of course I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a whole book about Disney and jazz coming out, and I don't even mention this movie. That's really the first big Disney animated movie to celebrate jazz in a specific way. And I was so angry. I was like, ah, dang it, what awful timing. Yeah, yeah.
you do an update. I'm sure we can get a
No,
petition
yeah,
going for an update. But jazz, even though the different eras and the different types of music or trends come and go, jazz is straight through a theme. So talk about that if you could.
yeah,
Why is it why is this such a common core theme across all the eras of Disney's music?
yeah. Well, and what helps with that is, when we say quote unquote jazz, that's such a huge umbrella of history of music. There's so many branches. I kind of view it as like the word jazz is a huge tree trunk, and there are just tons of branches that come out of that. So that's why, like in my in the book, chapter one, I do so much. I go into like kind of just laying a big foundation of like here are so many different genres that are sort of jazz or what I call jazz or jazz adjacent.
Yep.
You know, and some of it are things you wouldn't think of, and some of them are. So I think I talk about like ragtime and swing and Dixieland. I even go into barbershop and rhythm and blues
And the
and
blues, yeah.
Yeah, because are those always the thing you instantly think of when you hear the word jazz? No, but when you dive into it, the history and how the music is shaped, it's actually like an ancestor of it. So those are important to talk about too, because they wouldn't exist without jazz. And so when you widen that scope, which is why I really spent chapter one like trying to get everyone on the same page in terms of what does this even mean, this word jazz, because that is such a loaded word. And when you think of it like that, well, then yeah, of course, like it feels like everything Disney touches is somehow connected to jazz because it's such a huge range of music, and because from the get-go, Disney like music was such a huge pillar of everything they did, right? From as soon as they were able to make sound go into animation and synchronized sound, they did it with music first. They didn't do it with just dialogue. It was with music. And then once they started to do the animated features, they incorporated music. They were written like musicals. And when you walk around the parks, music is a huge part of it. From the get-go, music has always, you could tell Disney, the band, and also the corporation, really cared about what you're hearing, not just what you're seeing, which is lovely because Walt and the people who pioneered Disney, they were visual artists when they first started this whole journey. It was about the visuals, and so it's wonderful that they put so much importance on what you're hearing and the sound and how music can impact the visuals you're seeing. Um, and so almost everything Disney has done, and whether it's an attraction or a movie or a person voicing a character, like it somehow is all 6 degrees and traces something back to jazz because
Yeah.
jazz is such a huge plethora of so much stuff. I mean, even in the book, there's a million things I could have talked about in the book. So it was like, what do I pick and choose to kind of focus? And I think I even say in the first chapter, like this by no means is the extent of everything that is jazz and Disney related. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Um, but yeah, so it's fun to look at it through that lens because jazz is considered, by most historians as like the first true quintessential American art form. That it has influences from all of these different demographics, but like it was rooted in America, born by people here, from the blood, sweat, tears, the backs of it, especially from the African American community and the Black community, and then what that became, and then when white people got involved, what did that turn it into, and all of these things that are important discussions and wonderful discussions and complicated
Yeah.
discussions, and it depends on what we're talking about. Um, but because it has such a vast history and it's so important to the history of the nation of America from a music perspective, it's not shocking that Disney, who was really trying to define American entertainment and what is like America's way of telling a story, that jazz would be one of the most prominent ways to do that. That's also why in the beginning, like in the jazz world, I when I was younger, I used to do a lot of jazz clubs and also play with jazz musicians and all that stuff. And in the jazz world, so I think it's chapter two of the book where I dive into what we call standards. And in
Mhm.
the world of jazz, that we use this word standards a lot, which means like a standard should be this song has been kind of uh initiated into the catalog of jazz music that everyone should know, and everyone should be able to jump on stage and do it, and everyone's going to know it, and it's considered like a pillar song for jazz music. That's sort of what a standard is. And the earliest Disney songs became part of that. There's a handful of Disney songs that are still like jazz standards. And it's not, Princess and the Frog or, more modern some people. It's the classics. It's Alice in Wonderland. It's When You Wish
Mhm.
Upon a Star. It's Someday My Prince Will Come. And even though those don't necessarily initially sound quote unquote jazzy when you hear them, they kind of are in the way they're written, and that they were then adopted by the jazz community as a jazz standard because they're written in ways that were founded by the jazz composers. Um, So that was a long ramble. But basically, almost everything in Disney can be related to jazz if you want it to be, even if it doesn't feel like it is. If you take the time to do the research, it's just jazz is as much a foundation in Disney as anything else.
Yeah. And, to the point, like you said, jazz and America are rife with, conflict and resolution and learning and growing and evolving. And when you look at the movies, Aristocats, very jazzy, has animals, right?
Yeah.
Jungle Book, kind of jazzy, has animals. But then you get now when Princess and the Frog, who's the first, female, prominent female black character, and then Soul, again, black character focused on jazz, it's almost full circle. It's like recognizing, and if you have everyone politics aside, just like let's talk about what it actually is, which is an acknowledgement that the black community with people that founded and built jazz to what it is, and showing it in the movies. It's got to be a huge coming full circle thing for jazz as a movement.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, yeah, when because I wrote the book before Soul
Yeah,
thing, I ended with Princess and the Frog, which to me felt very poignant and poetic. And in the book, I even describe it as sort of like a circle of life kind of
totally.
metaphor in the sense of, yes, I know that um, there were complaints about like, we have our first, black Disney princess heroine, and now she's going to be a frog half the movie, which is valid. I get that. But in terms of what it's celebrating, because music is such a big portion of that, I found it very poignant in the sense of look how far we've come in full circleness of it. That Princess and the Frog, at the time was a big move of going back to sort of the 2D, sort of Renaissance era of musicals because they'd kind of left that during the 2000s.
Yeah,
So it was a big deal, and the way that they did that was let's really honor the history of jazz music. Let's honor New Orleans, which is considered like the birthplace of jazz. Let's finally honor African American and Black artists, and do it in a real way that's not sort of, Hercules sort of had that with gospel
yeah, good point.
and
Yeah,
the pieces. But Princess and the Frog really brought it to a new level. And so all of the, because my book sort of goes chronologically in history, and so much of the real history of jazz that I talk about in the first beginnings of the book, and you can see how jazz is forming, especially with New Orleans and all these incredible black artists that are making this sound happen. Well, now we get to 2010, I think it was, and you get Princess and the Frog, and we're honoring that, and it felt very authentic and real the way they were doing it. Um, so I love Princess and the Frog is one of my favorites, not
absolutely.
just because I think it's well done. Yes, I get why some people were aggravated of how it was handled. But I think what it was trying to do, a lot of it succeeded. And especially from the perspective of paying honor and homage to the city, the genre, the type of artists that built this music genre that helped build Disney. It felt poetic in a lot of ways. So I really enjoy getting to end the movie or ending my book with Princess and the Frog. It did feel sort of like a full circle.
It totally was. And I think to that end, full circle, and Soul's probably just an addendum, right? Because then Soul actually, instead of being jazz adjacent, it is literally jazz. I mean, it's a movie by a jazz musician, everything involved in the improvisation and everything involved in what wonderfully complex music it is that,
Yeah.
again, just captures it and maybe in its purest sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Soul definitely has its own strengths. Yeah, and it does it does the good and the bad of what Princess and the Frog did in terms of the way that they portrayed the music, and the representation was really well done. I loved watching the behind the scenes of how they were trying to even accuracy with like the fingers on the piano,
Sure.
which I love that kind of stuff. And then I also, there was controversy, kind of like Princess and the Frog of, well, why do we have a prominent black character that is now going to be like a blue
Not, yeah.
haired alien for half of it, right? Just
Yeah.
kind of like we have Chiana and now she's a green frog for half of it, which I get, the notion of like, why can't they just stay black and be
Yeah.
black? But again, that's sort of examples of, me when I was writing it. In the first chapter, I set up of here's how I'm going to approach race in this book. And I kind of have like a little section in the chapter one of like, this is when I'm going to talk about and not talk about it in
Yep.
terms. Am I going to say Black or African American? Well, depends on the research I'm quoting and the singer and what they wanted to be called and all that stuff. If I'm talking about a project, obviously, if I'm talking about just a project that involved a person of color, and it was, during the first half or middle part of the 1900s, there's probably not great stuff happening around that. But if every time something remotely problematic or racist or controversial took place, well, then the entire book would be that. Like, and I can't do that. So then it's when am I going to address it, right? So if it's something like Eartha Kitt, her chapter, well, race and what she went through was very much a part of her story. So I can't not talk about that. But some of the stuff with, silly symphonies or Aristocats or whatnot, yes, there's problematic stuff in it, but I'm not going to dive into it because what I'm going to talk about is the specific music thing or the specific artist. So trying to navigate, when do I talk about race? When do I not? How do I approach it? In The Princess and the Frog, I put a section in there of like, yes, here's acknowledging some of the criticism.
Sure.
But in general, and the elephant in the room of too, I'm a white male and I'm not blind to that. So I also made sure that as I was writing the book, that I went to people that I loved and respected, different friends who were people of color and different genders and identities and ages and backgrounds, to make sure, not to necessarily get their permission, but I really wanted validation. Like, am I handling this
Yeah.
right? Because again, it was hard to balance that of I can't write a book about jazz and not mention that there was something called racism in America. Like that would be ridiculous. I shouldn't write the book. But also you have publishers saying it's a fun beach read. Well, how do you balance that,
Yeah.
right? I don't want it to be preachy, but I don't want it to be whitewashed. And I'm a white male writing this book on jazz, and 80% of the chapters I'm writing about are people of color. And so it's, but I was excited because no one had written a book like this before. So it was tricky. But I, especially navigating that, I definitely went to people as I was writing it, and they gave me some good advice and helped me reword some stuff or help me figure out like what's the best angle for this, or does that sentence come off the way that I think it's coming off, because you have to acknowledge your own
Perfect
blind.
knowledge.
Yeah, that's what I tell my students. So it would be ridiculous for me to write a book about jazz and not acknowledge the elephant in the room that I'm a white male writing it.
And maybe that's just part of it, is that acknowledgement, right? You're open, you're transparent about it. This is what we're going to talk about. There's some good, there's some bad, but then again, some beautiful stuff came out of it. And I think that's kind of what the very essence of it is no matter the tension, no matter what happened, music resulted, makes people happy, and there's something to be said for that. And speaking of happy and magical, let me shift to the parks, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not just the movies, but you also do a great thing of kind of just saying, this is, if you just walk through the parks, this is what you hear, this kind of jazz. And again, New Orleans being the core and center of it, Disneyland, which I know you just said you just went to the first time, New Orleans Square, everything there is, you can't, you're completely inundated with jazz, but talk about how jazz is weaved throughout the parks and what that does, why they do it, and how it makes people feel.
Yeah, I mean, because again, it was very obvious as Walt was building parks that he wanted this sort of Americana, like, except for the portions that are supposed to represent different regions of the world. But, this notion of like, well, what is mainstream? If this is what America, quote unquote, looks like, what does America, quote unquote, sound like?
Mhm.
And because so much of American sound and music has roots and all of these tree branches, right, coming from the jazz truck. And so yeah, like I love when I walk around the park and hearing the music. There's just so many remnants of jazz everywhere on rides, on attractions, even at the resorts. I love in Walt Disney World. There's a section of a resort that's dedicated to jazz, and
Yeah.
you have these crazy 3-story tall silhouettes of artists and black trumpet players and musicians and a drummer and all of these wonderful things to celebrate the sound and the history and the culture and the people of jazz. And even like I told you before we started recording, I had gone to yes, I'd been to Disneyland finally for the first time this past year because I live on this side of the country, so
Sure.
Disney has been my thing, and I got to go to Disneyland Paris last year for the first time. And there was also a lot of jazz in there too because jazz also made a huge um, it had its own huge wave in Paris from when the wars, American soldiers were going over there and brought jazz to Paris, and there was this huge Paris movement of jazz. And so jazz is everywhere. And so it was fun to get to write that chapter of here are different ways, different rides and different resorts and shows and parks you can see. And here's little fun things to look out for to try to pick up on jazz. Of course, it's always changing. I mean, I think I started the chapter with like, at the time I'm writing this is what is right. Like for example, Splash Mountain is obviously changing, so you're not going to hear
Tiana, speaking
the
of
Splash
jazz, yeah.
Mountain. Yeah, which I love. I love that because again, I just said Princess and the Frog is one of my favorite Disney movies,
Sure.
so I think it's fantastic that they did that. But yeah, like jazz is fun and I don't know, it really is kind of everywhere. And also it's really popular nowadays, even if something wasn't written as a jazz song to do like a jazz version of it. Like if you go to Spotify and you type in Disney jazz, millions of things come up. Like jazzy covers of Disney music is one of the most popular ways to cover music in the industry. You would think it would be like pop or rock, but it's actually jazz when you look at the numbers. And so that's also very evident. So it's fun to see just everywhere is jazz, whether something was meant to initially be written like jazz music, like, Princess and the Frog and Aristocats and I mean, just so much stuff was jazzy. A lot of the stuff from the 60s, or stuff that is just now popular to do jazzy covers of and do like a jazzy spin on it. If you go see the stage shows at the parks, there's oftentimes we'll do a jazzy version of something. And like I said, if you go online and look at different music platforms or even YouTube and you type in Disney jazz, just so much stuff comes up. People love a good jazzy cover of a
Yeah.
song of, and Disney is very much a part of that.
It makes it happy. So I always like to ask Disney related type questions. So we're kind of talking in the parks with all the jazz elements. What's your favorite jazz Disney park interaction? Like where's the intersect? What do you walk down and go like that? I love this mixture of being in the parks and feeling the jazz or one of the
Oh,
branches.
yeah, guys. That's a good question. Probably, so hard. I really enjoyed I really loved Splash Mountain in the sense of yes, I very much acknowledge all the all the callbacks,
Get it? Disclaimers
but
aside. Yeah.
yeah, but the instrumentation
Ah,
in it because it was a great balance of when you listen to the music of that attraction and how it was arranged and orchestrated. Because I'm sort of the geek as you're riding the ride, I'm really listening to like the speaker that's hidden and like how is
totally.
this music arranged and the orchestration part. And the music on it, which is why Princess and the Frog kind of is a nice sort of blend into that and nicely replaces it. Because of the music in Splash Mountain, I really thought it did a good job of how it was arranged and orchestrated in terms of having jazz influence, but also country and Western and Americana. And it was a really interesting blend of all of these things because that's sort of what happened in a lot part of the country as jazz was coming up, right? What happens when New Orleans jazz meets bluegrass Appalachia, right? Like, and so I really enjoyed the blending of that. I thought the music in Splash Mountain did a good job of doing this sort of Americana Appalachian jazz trinity, which I thought was really interesting. So I would probably say that. But what I really enjoy about the parks is going through and hearing genres that now, after I wrote the book, again with the notion of the genres that most people wouldn't necessarily associate with jazz, but when you look at like, well, actually, it has a whole history and rooted, something like the Dapper Dans. Most people don't think of barbershop quartet, four white guys singing in the kind of old church style harmony, but
Yeah.
that has. And I would have never really thought that either. But like in chapter one, I do a section on, barbershop of like, actually, when you look at the history and you look at actually where it came from and how it's arranged and the people that really helped found it, and what it actually does have a lot of jazz roots. It just became this stereotype now of what we think of it. So there's so much stuff with ragtime, even the ragtime piano player on Main
Oh, I
Street.
was just about to say that's my favorite. In front of Casey's Corner. First of all, it's amazing. Second of all, they are phenomenally talented. The
Yeah.
technique is out of just
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
ridiculously good.
Ragtime is so, I mean, because as a piano player
You
too, ragtime
appreciate it.
is so insanely difficult. But yeah, that genre is extremely important
Yeah.
when you look at the historical evolution of jazz. So that I enjoy more than like the blatant obvious jazz that you can hear. If there's a jazz band playing in the park or something, I like hearing something that people might walk by and not think it's jazz, but now knowing like all the history behind that and the people who helped build that, and now it's become this. We've turned it into this, but like there's so much roots in it. I have so much more respect for jazz now as an adult than I did as a like in high school and college when I was playing jazz music all the time in bands and in clubs and whatnot. But I'd never really truly knew just how vast that history is and how expansive it was. It's like an endless ocean. Like
Yeah.
everything in music somehow goes back to jazz. It just does. And I think that's phenomenal.
It's great. And like I said, the book just does a great job of encapsulating the history and mixing Disney together, which is great. Matt, please, what do you got? What are you working on now? What are you working on now? And how can people find you? How can people follow you? How can we get more of Matt Hodge?
The easiest way to find me is to go to my official website, matthodge.com. I'm not really so a month ago, I was the victim of a really awful hacking.
Oh no.
Basically, I had to get rid of all my social media and everything.
Uh,
It was a nightmare. So I'm not really on social media anymore, but that's fine. But I have my website that I use, and that's my sort of central hub of everything. So you can see music projects I'm doing or my writings. I just finished, I did those two books back to back, the Batman book and the Disney book. I've been doing a lot more academic writings lately. So I've had several academic books and chapters and conferences doing that quite a bit, and still teaching and doing a lot of random music projects and theater stuff. And yeah, I'm sort of always busy doing something. But yeah, my website, if you go to it, that's usually where you can at least see a lot of my official projects and writings and things like that.
No, that is great. Well, I so appreciate your time. It was so great. Thank you for sharing. And I really do have to say, well, you mentioned, a couple of times, it's summer. And if you need a summer beach read, Cool Cast and Hot Mouse for if you love music, if you love Disney, if you love music and Disney, if you no matter what, it's just a fascinating. And it is, by the way, mission accomplished, super accessible. It's a very good balance between being, there's that academic piece which you can tell you're a part of, but anyone can read it, anyone can understand it, anyone can love it. So could not
Thank you.
recommend it highly enough.
Oh,
No.
I appreciate that. That means a lot to me. I really wanted the book to ultimately, by the time you finish it, feel very warm and celebratory, and I really loved that. And some of the awards that it won, I was blown away that it would even be nominated for. I think it was nominated for like 6 or 7 national awards, but one of them was like the Institution of Jazz Recordings, like so it definitely got a stamp of validation from people in the industry that I really respected, and it meant a lot to me. So I appreciate that. And yeah, if you go to my website, I'll have all the links to where you can buy it at Barnes and Noble or Amazon or all the fun stuff. But I so appreciate you reading it. It's been nice to revisit it because I wrote it 4 years ago, so I kind of have not forgotten it, but I've sort of moved on to other projects. So it's been nice to revisit it.
It was great. I appreciate. Look, like I said, Disney Music Podcast had to have you on. I'm so pleased. Thank you for your time. Encourage everyone to read it, and please, would love to speak with you again soon.
Oh yes, please, anytime. Yes, and everyone listen to the new podcast. It's exciting. I'm thrilled to help launch it.
You sure? Thank you so much, Matt. Pleasure speaking. I'll speak with you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So, time for some Disney music news. What you just heard was some of the music from the amazing Michael Giacchino. If you are not familiar with him, he's written the music for Up as well as The Incredibles and Ratatouille. And that is a new track from his lounge style film score covers album called Exotic Themes for the Silver Screen. Pop culture collectibles company Mutant will release Giacchino's Exotic Themes for the Silver Screen Volume 1 on streaming platforms, digital retailers, and will be available for pre-order on independent record stores starting today, July 26th. The album features 24 tracks from the themes of several films and TV shows, including Alias, The Incredibles, Lost, Sky High, Ratatouille, Up, and Cars 2. It's been inspired by the Exotica music style works of Arthur Lyman and Martin Denny. The new album will feature a variety of covers from across his works, as I mentioned, from video game scores to his television hits and blockbuster films, transformed from their original arrangements via instruments like vibraphones and marimbas, the music lexicon of the Exotica genre. You can hear the two tracks, the one track I just played, which of course is Married Life from Up, as well as Lax from Lost. That's available on Spotify now. Go out and grab that. It sounds like it's going to be terrific. The second bit of Disney music news is the Deadpool and Wolverine soundtrack was just released. Hollywood Records announced Marvel Studios' Deadpool and Wolverine original motion picture soundtrack, featuring a collection of 18 songs, which is releasing on July 24th. The soundtrack will be available on CD, on vinyl, and the original score digital album will also be available on July 24th as well. Looking at the track listing, it is not surprising. It is eclectic, to say the least. I can just picture some of the scenes in my mind that are going to be going on with some of these songs. You have Bye 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 by NSYNC, Angel of the Morning, which has been a recurring song across the Deadpool movies, Glamorous by Fergie, Ramblin' Man by Waylon Jennings, Lady in Red by Krista Berg, The Greatest Show, of course, from The Greatest Showman, which we all know Hugh Jackman was a part of as well. I can only imagine how that's going to be utilized. You're the One That I Want by Olivia Newton-John and John Travolta, and even I'll Be Seeing You by Jimmy Durante. So it seems like a fantastic, super eclectic mist of songs. I'm sure there's going to be ultra violent stuff happening over the happiest of songs, but I cannot wait to see it. So far, the movie opens up on Friday. Reviews have been exceptionally good so far, so very much looking forward to seeing that and hearing how the music corresponds to it. And that's actually it this week for Disney Music News. Well, that's it for this week's episode of the Music Behind the Magic podcast. Again, I want to thank Matt Hodge for his time and his insight. Would recommend you all take a look at his book, Cool Cats and a Hot Mouse, A History of Jazz and Disney. Easy to read, interesting to read, super informative for Disney fans and music fans alike. You can find it on Amazon or any bookstore. Also, again, want to thank all of you for being a part of the community, for your insights, for your support. Couldn't do it without you, and appreciate you giving me a forum to be able to share my love of Disney, and hopefully you're able to share that love with me through these podcasts as well. Just as a quick note, the next episode probably won't be out for about 2 weeks or so. I am headed out with my family to Europe for both vacation as well as work. One of those stops on our vacation will be Disneyland Paris, so looking forward to giving maybe a little bit of a trip report and a music trip report as well. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy a couple more weeks of summer, and I hope you all have a very, very magical musical day. Thanks so much. Look forward to speaking with you all again real soon.